Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth lecture in the series, and I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Today we have Dr. Ian Malcolm Rijsdijk, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Film and Media Studies here at UCT. He was schooled in Cape Town and received both his undergrad and postgrad degrees here at the University of Cape Town. Ian teaches at all levels, from the introductory first-year courses right the way through to PhD supervision. And in fact, his teaching endeavor has won him a Distinguished Teacher Award here at UCT recently, in 2014, I think, and also the National Award for Teaching Excellence. In addition to this teaching, he's part of a new research grouping, the Environmental Humanities South program here at UCT. And today he's going to talk about some of his work and tell us a bit about media, science, and the public sphere. So I'll leave it to you, Ian.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Is that good sound for everyone at the back? Excellent, great. Welcome. This is what I'm presenting today is a little bit about what I'm hoping to move into in the next year or two. I've been commissioned to write chapters on climate change communication, which is a relatively new field for me. So what's quite exciting about this research is it's mostly new for me as well. So you are my first audience for some of this presentation today. Up until now, the first 3 days, you've been confronted with some quite formidable scientists, and I'm not that person. Okay, so I will be doing no science today. So I need to make the point that I'm not a scientist, okay? And I'm going to probably reiterate that at some point when people ask me difficult questions about CO2 and carbon emissions and so forth, and I'm just going to say, well, I'm not a scientist, so really I don't know. And with respect to my colleague yesterday, Dr. Johnny Peter, I'm not even a real doctor, I'm a fake doctor. So if one of you comes up and says, I'm ill, all I can prescribe for you is a course of Italian neorealism, watch a movie at night, watch one the next morning, and hopefully you'll feel a bit better. So it's important this, because what I'm going to be dealing with today is science of a sort, but it's not science as well. And I think that division between those two ideas, or that relationship between those two ideas, is a lot of what I want to be looking at. So today's lecture really is some thoughts on science and social science in the media. That's really what I want to cover. There's lots of images to look at. So I'll be looking at particularly at visual representations and also some ideas around words and the way words are used in the media to often mean different things. And essentially, I've got a big case study which is on climate change communication. I was going to talk about fracking, which I've just completed a book chapter on the language of fracking in the Karoo. And so I can take questions on that. That's a field that I've done quite a lot of reading in. But I wanted to do the climate change communication today because I think it's a little bit more provocative. And I think it offers some really interesting material for you guys to look at and to ask questions about. And then if we've got time at the end, and I sort of will be referring to this idea throughout, is this idea of the danger of images or dangerous images, how we view images, how we should deconstruct or consider images that we confront in the media. So going back to this first image that I used at the title, it introduces a sort of series of contexts for this entire talk. So I suppose the umbrella for this entire talk are a couple of sort of ideas or concepts, philosophies, if you want to call them that. The first is this notion of the Anthropocene, Discourses of the Anthropocene. It's a term that you've probably hearing more and more of if you're reading even in the mainstream newspapers, but certainly in science and humanities publications. And very simply what it refers to is the idea that the influence of humans on the Earth systems is so profound as to constitute a new geological epoch. So one of the big issues that the term has been around for a while, it became more established in the sort of early 2000s. And there's now a huge debate about when does the Anthropocene start? Do we look at the Industrial Revolution? Do we look at the beginning of agriculture? At what point the discovery of fire is another one? So there's all these kind of debates now about how we mark the beginning of what might be termed the Anthropocene. And the idea is that maybe in thousands of years' time we could literally look at a core sample of the Earth or a tree ring and would be able to tell, as we can with other ages, exactly when a particular the human influence or human engagement intervention changed the geology or the lithosphere of the planet. So this idea of the tree rings, this is actually a sculpture made out of credit cards. You made using a credit card, not a tree ring. And I think it's actually a plastic sculpture that resembles wood. And so an idea, to some extent, that's this concept for me, or this image really kind of brings together these ideas of a plastic reality or a plastic contemporary environment, something that is also inauthentic in some fundamental way. So then there's this idea of science as something that's social, science as something that is ideological. And John Law talks about this quite nicely. He says, in the sociology of scientific knowledge, it doesn't matter whether scientific knowledge is true or false. Since the same kinds of social processes are at work in each, we need the same methods to explain both. So this is quite an interesting starting point, controversially. You're kind of saying it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. Now, to some extent, what Jeff said on Monday is there's a relation to that. The idea that we need to know when we're wrong as well as when we're right. It's not about proving things right all the time. It's often about proving things wrong or knowing when you're wrong. But the key thing here is about process. It's how you get to that answer. So for the sociology approach to science, the processes that you would use to get to the right and the wrong answer are equal. There's a symmetry in those two. And that's the key thing to think about. Law continues, he says, following Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a very influential book in the 1960s, he says, theories, methods, perceptions, practices, and institutional arrangements. And each one of those ideas could probably take up a lecture about what is a theory, what is a method, what is a perception, how do we balance a perception against a theory. And institutional arrangements are all mixed together. This is important because it suggests that methods are not simply techniques, but carry personal, very important, skill-related, theoretical, and other agendas. So there's a whole lot of really important words, agendas being one of them, okay? Skill-related, people having different backgrounds, bringing their thoughts to a particular discourse, and we'll see that particularly later with climate change. The other idea around this, which comes from Anders Hansen, is that the success of environmental claims in the news media will often depend on the extent to which such claims engage or resonate with deeper cultural images, beliefs, and perceptions. So one of the interesting things briefly about the fracking talk that I did, or the fracking chapter I worked on, was one of the early statements around the viability of fracking in the Karoo was when the Minister, I think it was of Energy at that point, said that fracking was a gift from God. Okay, this was widely reported in the media. And it was widely dismissed by a lot of people as well. People said, sounds ridiculous. It's just another evidence of how the government's got it wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually look at what she's saying, it's a very important point because it's tapping into a very, very entrenched and long-standing history of missionary education in South Africa. A gift from God is something that one doesn't take lightly. So when that phrase was used, instead of just dismissing it out of hand, what people should have been doing is thinking, well, what constituency does this kind of phrase really refer to? What does it relate to? Similarly, if you look at fracking, and I did a survey, I sampled like 20 websites, news websites in South Africa, and every single one of them used the same type of image to talk about fracking in the Karoo. Can you tell me what it is? What image just recurs again and again? It's a windmill, a lonely windmill. Okay, so the solitary windmill was the marker for virtually every news story around fracking that I could find. And what was really interesting about that was a lot of the news stories were talking about how fracking was this invasive human intervention in the landscape, as if a windmill, which is an indicator of an invasive human intervention in the landscape, was somehow benign and had no effect. Stands in for agriculture, stands in for a whole range of things. So those were just two very, very simple examples of Hansen's idea that if we have to see the success of science communication, we have to think about what are the deeper cultural resonances for the reader of that communication. What are they getting out of it? Okay, the scientists might have the best view in the world about why their theory or why their communication is right, but if they can't understand the constituency of people who are reading what they write, then there's going to be no engagement. Okay. So Maxwell Boykoff, who's a very, very well-regarded climate communications writer, says, a continuing challenge to communicating about climate change has been how to accurately and fairly represent, and I love this phrase, the contours of uncertainty. Okay? So, there we go. It's nice. It's not only my first years. That's fine. At least yours is more subtle. It isn't like a booming beat that comes through. So this notion of the contours of uncertainty, the idea that we need uncertainty. How do we navigate this notion of uncertainty? How do we talk about something that's 100% right or 100% wrong? And again, I'll get to that in the case study later. And then he says, moreover, greater scientific understanding actually can contribute to more complicated policy decision-making by offering up a greater supply of knowledge from which to develop and argue varying interpretations of that science. So not even for public consumption, but even for policy, the thinking is that you dump more and more and more science into that space, it becomes harder to make a decision, not easier. Okay? And again, climate change is a fantastic example of that, of exactly that problem that we're finding today. Okay, so this is really the case study, the idea of communicating climate, and I've put the changer in brackets as exactly to indicate how we communicate about climate generally and also about climate change specifically. Just look at those images for a moment. The one on the left is Hurricane Katrina from 2005, and the one on the right, just look at that image and just think about it for a moment. I'll get back to it later. So think about what that image means to you, how it makes you feel. It's going to sound very therapeutic for a moment. How does that image make you feel? Okay. And I'll get back to the wording later. Okay. So one of the things we deal with in climate change is this notion of discourses. Okay. So you have there's lots of them, but basic ones or basic kind of binaries would be the idea of the expert discourse and the popular discourse, often versus or in collusion with. And then also global, national, local discourses. Okay, so an example of an expert discourse is obviously a scientist, someone who works at university, who is pronounced an expert on the topic. A more popular discourse, for example, might be the weatherman. So think about how many times you've heard about climate change coming from meteorologists. Okay, and one of the key findings in the States recently was that I think it's less than 25% of registered meteorologists working for news networks believes in climate change. So 75%, 3/4 of weathermen and weatherwomen on US TV are essentially climate change deniers. And of course, weather people are in your TV all the time. They're in your home, they're on TV constantly. So why do we trust the weatherman? You know, the old adage, the weatherman's always wrong. So the idea of the climatologist or the meteorologist who appears on TV is a good example of a kind of popular discourse. Okay. Then there's the idea of global, national, local discourses. Fracking was quite interesting in this regard in terms of thinking about how one of the arguments often used in the press was, well, it works here, so therefore it must also work in this place, despite the fact that the conditions in the Karoo are fundamentally different from the conditions in Poland, the conditions in the United Kingdom, or in Pennsylvania in the States. So this idea of like a global and a national local is another way of thinking about discourses. How do we talk about something that relates to a small group of people here, or how do we address an issue that has global consequences? And they relate these things, this understanding of discourses affects the relationship between messages. So for example, very simply in the fracking case, there were lots of different, I eventually played out numerous different discourses. There was the government discourse, there was activist discourse, there was media discourse, and all of these, in effect, overlapped or rubbed against one another. So when you had, for example, people walking out of a town hall meeting in the Karoo because it was presented by Shell, you had a conflict between a sort of expert discourse and a popular local discourse. When you had people protesting outside Parliament, again, you had these sort of conflicts. So the idea about understanding the discourses are, in a way, fields of knowledge that guide how we learn about something is quite important. And a good example, just quick one here, John Howard, thankfully previous Prime Minister of Australia, at one point said, "I don't take policy advice from films," when he refused to meet Al Gore. So the weird thing about it was that, you know, that phrase, the clash of discourses, is really interesting there. On the one hand, you can dismiss the comment as just being throwaway, as something that he says off the cuff, but actually what it reveals is he's firstly maintaining that there's no value to be derived from a film anyway. There's no knowledge that can be extracted from that. He's also equating Gore as a filmmaker, not as a politician. There's a whole lot of things going on there. So it's interesting to see how even a simple comment like that reveals, if we want to understand why that comment feels wrong or feels weird, it's because of the discourses that are involved and how they don't sort of seem to match up. So this is a longish quote, and I think it's the last one I've got, so I'm going to break it into 3 parts because I think it gives us a sort of an entry point into the climate change understanding. So given that climate is a statistical phenomenon that is not observable on a daily basis. And I'll get to why that's important just now. People form their attitudes toward climate change indirectly. Okay? So the first step of thinking about why all of you in this room have probably formed an opinion about climate change is think, well, how did we come to that position? What were the processes we went through to develop that particular understanding or that particular opinion? Okay? So one way is thinking about it, that it's not observable on a daily basis. So when we render an opinion about it, we're actually gathering together a whole lot of other things that are kind of orbiting around us, clouding the mind, and we're saying, well, because of A, B, C, and D, and that, I'm going to make this opinion. Okay? It's not necessarily a direct thing. It's not as easy as saying, is this hot or cold? Or do you like X or Y? Whereas an immediate response. It's indirect. People's perception of climate change is affected by their attitudes and values, including environmental attitudes and political affiliation. I love this word value. It's one of those kind of really, really insidious words. It just lurks all the time. You know, what's the value of something really? Okay, so we have, and we tend to think of value in very obvious terms, like what's the value of a liter of milk? Well, it's X in this shop and Y in that shop. But values are also very, very, they have much broader moral and ideological consequences than that. What moral values do you have? Ooh, well, that's a bit tricky, okay? So attitudes and values are completely unscientific. I think Johnny talked about the idea of the human complexity, was it, yesterday? And this is human complexity in action. Our attitudes and our values and the psychology of that are what bring us to making that opinion, of being able to produce that opinion about something. Finally, as these two authors note, the cultural cognition of risk suggests that individual risk perception is influenced by group values. Our perception of risk in a particular sense, we're going to look for advice from others. We're going to want to be part of the crowd, okay? Including those related to individualism, community, authority, and equality. Now, one can go down the rabbit hole of trying to understand how all these things relate to being citizens in a community. I've used the word public quite often, and publics in general. And there's a whole other debate going on there about how we constitute a public, who are we as citizens, how we understand even functioning in democracy. But the key thing about this here is this idea of this individualism and the idea of the group value, how those two things relate to one another. So how we we might have a private opinion, but we can't express it amongst others because it might be unpopular. It might be the wrong thing, okay? So we often find ourselves caught in a bind between a set of group values that we want to maintain because of a whole lot of normally associated values and an individual thing that we may have come to by reading or by studying something or by being in conversation with somebody, okay? So these are the factors that influence the potential to develop an opinion on climate change. Okay, so I've got a few mini case studies around climate change I want to explore. The first one is what I call the moment in the bath. It's a phrase often used for my creative writers, and it basically relates to that moment where an idea hits us. You're lying in the bath and you think, I wonder why, and then whatever comes in after that. Okay, it doesn't have to be in the bath. You have to think about each other in the bath. It might just be walking in nature. It might be doing something, but it's normally a moment of reflection where you wonder, I wonder why, or I wonder if, or I wonder what. Okay, and I often tell my students, if you can find that moment in the bath in your idea, then you can recover what you were talking about. You need to figure out what you were thinking about at that moment that gave you the moment in the bath. So my moment of the bath for getting interested in this topic years ago was an ETV promo that ran in about 2006 or 7 somewhere, that was basically addressing climate change, but it used this kind of classic montage of catastrophe, which included a whole lot of scenes from the tsunami in 2004. Which had very little to do with climate change. You could argue indirectly that yes, it's got to do with population and where people build and deforestation and so forth, but really it was, and it's exactly that kind of unthinkingness that gives people that gives climate change an eyes, particularly a lot of, look at this ridiculous news montage. None of that is climate change. It's just a whole lot of bad stuff happening. People freak out. That's how it works. So I was very annoyed by ETV for being so flagrantly sensationalist and unscientific about putting together something as simple as a montage of images. And that's where the idea about the danger of images also started percolating for me. And it also teased into this notion, which is used quite often, called the finite pool of worry. That for all of us, we have a finite pool of worry. There is just too much stuff that we worry about. And if you get something that's too big, then, there's that great scene in Annie Hall. If anyone's seen Annie Hall, the Woody Allen film, where earlier on in the film, like he doesn't want to go to school anymore, and he says to his doctor, he says, But doctor, the universe is expanding. Yes. He says, eventually it's going to expand and swallow up everything. Yes. So we're not going to exist. Yes. He says, why do I have to go to school? You know, I don't want to do this anymore. He says, because that's not going to happen for billions of years more, Alvi. So you better make the best of it while you can. Okay. So the finite pool of worry really suggests that the problem for us is there's so much stuff in our lives that we worry about, whether it's basic everyday needs like purchasing things, debt, paranoia about security, whatever. Then there's another range of things beyond that, whether it's our community issues around helping people, or whether about crime or about the economy. There's a broader issue beyond that around, you know, whether it might be reconciliation and decolonization in South Africa. There's a broader issue beyond that. So when someone says climate change, you know, in like 2,000 years' time, this is going to happen. People are like, whoa, I just want to get through today, really. I just want to get to Friday, maybe, if I'm optimistic, and maybe next month. That'll be good, you know. So the idea of the finite pool of worry is a key term when thinking about media, particularly. How, with all those stories and ideas competing for our attention in the media, how do we care about things that have got long lives, that have got long extensions, okay, long durations? And that's the thing I'm going to get to hopefully at the end of today. So that's and it leads to this notion of slow violence, which I'll get to at the end. Case study 2 is about how we communicate these. So we're beginning to look at images now. So on the left is a kind of standard little graphic that's used, I found on an education website, looking at environmental communication. And it's very simply the idea of the metaphor. So the girl on the left is talking about climate change in terms of ice in the sea, and the guy on the right says, it means like ice blocks in a drink. So you can immediately see that even though there's some similarity in their understanding of it, there's a very, very different frame of reference. Okay. On the right, and I don't know how many of you remember this, if those of you who are attentive to American news, this was, when was it? 2000, and I think it was early last year. James Inhofe, who's the Republican, he's one of the most conservative Republican senators. He also happens to be the chair of the Senate Committee on Environment and Climate in the United States. And he walked into Senate with a snowball, okay? And he said, so much for climate change, it's cold outside. And he holds up a snowball in the Senate as proof, metaphorically, that climate change doesn't exist because it's cold. It was February. It's pretty freaking cold in Washington in February. There's probably a high likelihood that there will be snow on the ground, okay? Be that as it may, there was Inhofe with his snowball. Now, the snowball, in some respects, kudos to him, quite a smart gimmick. It's kind of a nice tactic. You walk in and he threw it at somebody, I think. I think he lobbed it at President Obama. But the point about it is, it was a metaphor. It was a very, very compelling moment, because up until then, no one really gave a tinker's cuss about what Senate was saying about climate change, because it was so boring. It was just here was committee meetings and planning, and then here's Inhofe with his snowball. All of a sudden, people got interested. There was a whole series of very funny memes that ran on the internet, like terrible song from Frozen, Do You Want to Build a Snowman, with James Inhofe singing it, and all kinds of other things. So it eventually became a thing. It became this kind of quite widely disseminated media event, was Inhofe's snowball. But it does make us aware of the power of metaphor in trying to communicate around climate. And Donald Trump's done the same thing. He says, brrr, it's February, it's cold, there can't be any climate change. And he said that already several times this year. It's still January, actually. He's already said it a few times.
Do they say climate change, or do they say global warming still?
Oh, global warming, yeah.
Joke, like it's cold outside. So
it's cold outside, so it can't be. Yeah. So he's done it last year. He's probably doing it now as well. So so the idea is that the metaphor of the snowball, it was a very, very powerful little visual metaphor there. This is another one that I came across on a rather bland and non-committal site in the UK. And I thought about it after one. I thought to myself, it makes a very interesting metaphor, because it suggests, what does it suggest? Crossroads. But what is... It suggests that environment and economy, I think what they meant to say was we're at a crossroads. Okay, we've come to a point where we need to make a decision. What it says to me is that economy and environment are inimical. They cannot, they can't work together. They are at cross purposes to one another, which I was thinking that's rather problematic. Did you really, you want to mail the guy, did you really intend to say that economy and environment are actually... So this is the kind of bland, sort of meaningless image that you would probably find in an image library that you could dump into any news website that looks at climate change or global warming. But actually, what does it mean when we see an image like that? So again, this is the kind of the danger of the mundanity of images, the banality of images. Okay, case study 3 is counter, again, strategies. So this is kind of interesting. This is something I came across last year when I was looking at energy lobbyists and PR firms and how they were communicating climate change. And these 3 points here came from a leaked document or a sort of leaked presentation given by a guy called Richard Berman. I'll get to him later. He's called Dr. Evil by some people in the industry. And he was giving a presentation to oil company CEOs about how to communicate around fossil fuels. And he said these were his guidelines to them. So this is now speaking from the other side of the fence, so to speak. He says, reframe the debate. Don't let opponents define the issue. And this could actually apply to both. So his concern was that every time a big issue came up, it was the kind of lefty pinko liberals who defined the debate, so that what happened was that the lobbyists were always responding. They were always having to counter what had already been put into play. He said, get ahead of the game, put in your claim first, so the opposition has to counter it. Okay? So this was his one strategy for oil firms. Second one is redirect the debate before you have to react. Okay? So, for example, if something comes out, redirect it into a secondary debate before you have to react to the main topic of discussion. And that's happened quite often with, for example, big films like An Inconvenient Truth and Gasland, where a particular angle has been taken to redirect what that film says into another avenue to basically take focus away from what it's actually about. And the third one, very simply, was undermine the integrity of characters in the narrative, which meant anything from basically catching them in bed with a prostitute to revealing their bank accounts on the internet, whatever it might take. So he basically advocated character assassination in this particular seminar. So these were kind of strategies, and of course it's an ad hom attack. It's attacking the messenger rather than the message. It's really important there. So here's an example. This is now going back to that image I said to you just now that I wanted you to think about how it made you feel. So, and this is what in the media referred to as mirroring. So on the right is the IPCC climate change report, Climate Change 2013, the physical science basis. So this is a document where if you want to read about the physical science evidence for climate change and global warming, that's a document you go to if you want to read the IPCC report. The one on the left, Climate Change Reconsidered, which physical science, which looks kind of similar. And if you go back to that one I had earlier, this one over here, whoa, it's quite a long way back, wasn't it? There, that one there. How did that make you feel? What does that image say to you? Sorry? Hot? No, it doesn't say. You confirmation bias. You're saying what you want. It's it's relaxing. It's kind of tranquil. It's a field of wheat. It's got sense. It's got a, no, the one on the right. Sorry, this one here. For you guys, it was the other way around. Yeah, this one here. It's kind of tranquil. It's a field of wheat. It's got sense of wholesomeness. It's a nice, beautiful evening. It's a lovely sunset. Not kind of clouded by radioactive dust. It's just a lovely kind of, it's a Midwest sunset. Okay. So this was also the NIPCC. Now the IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay. The NIPCC, and you can see how similar their documents look, is the non-governmental, et cetera, et cetera. It's funded by oil industry essentially. But what they do is that whenever the IPCC or an affiliated body releases a document, the NIPCC releases a similar document that looks the same. Okay, so they look very, very similar. They even have the same subtitle, physical science basis. So these documents are released to mirror one another so that you can, and it does a number of things. Firstly, it says, well, there's a contested debate here. Okay, there's a debater on the science, and this is how one can read both sides of the story, which I think is perfectly valid in terms of if one wants to come to a kind of consensus in yourself about what you think, you want to read as much as possible. You want to read as many competing views as possible. But it's quite interesting that it makes extensive use of media and imagery to create that kind of uncertainty, okay, that conundrum, which I'll get to just now. Here's another one. So on the left here is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. This is the main government organization that basically does, anything from wildlife refuges to fugitive methane emissions to whatever it might be. The EPA is the organization that oversees environmental protection in the United States. It's a government department. Okay, it's part of the government strategy. On the right is the EPA, the Environmental Policy Alliance, which seems relatively banal and kind of well-meaning. The Environmental Policy Alliance is a for-profit company established by Berman, amongst others, but it's funded by the Koch brothers. It's essentially a pro-oil, pro-fossil fuel organization. But when you see the two together, if you type in EPA into Google, you're going to get as many hits for this one as you do for that one. Okay? So if you're just doing your search and you think, well, I want to find out more about the EPA, be careful which EPA you start reading about. Yeah?
Isn't one of the things about trademark and copyright laws supposed to prevent ambiguousness between?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine how long it would take, how many years in court it would take to sort that one out. There's nothing to stop me having an organization that happens to have the same acronym as another one. So there's nothing illegal about this at all. It's not a legal issue really at all, but it really is it's about how the consumer, the public, educates itself about where they want the information to come from. This is about the kind of, again, the danger of images. Okay. So here is a very much obvious one. On the left is one of the posters for An Inconvenient Truth, the Davis Guggenheim film, often referred to as the Al Gore film, even though he actually didn't direct it, that featured Al Gore. And on the right was the Heartland Institute, I think it was funded rebuttal called An Inconvenient Truth or a Convenient Fiction. Not the catchiest title ever. And what they tried to do, obviously, was to match the graphic, and then they flipped the smokestack into a hurricane. In other words, everything's normal. All this stuff is just normal. It's part of the kind of standard everyday events that we have. So Richard Berman, famously, in one of his interviews, he says that when they had a labor union bus, he was, by the way, just a quick thing about him, in case this sounds like an ad hominem attack. Berman was famous for being hired by beverage companies, by alcoholic beverage companies in the 90s. There was a very famous case where a woman, her young child was killed by a drunk driver, and she lobbied the government to enforce tougher regulations on alcohol and driving. And Berman started a lobby. Berman was the chief lobbyist by alcohol beverage companies that basically essentially denigrated her in the public press to prevent her from making her case to Senate. So he's also represented William Morris, the smoking people. He's represented oil. He's a big gun lobbyist as well. So he's pretty much he runs like 25 or 26 NGOs out of a single office in Washington, and they're all basically like the EPA that he has, all part of this way. So he's a disinformation lobbyist expert. Okay. So an example here, what he does is they had a labor union bus followed by, he says, our own bus or truck, what you would call street theater. So he literally will, if someone's doing a tour, he will put his own bus that follows after it and basically undoes what's gone before it. Okay. Huge amounts of money. So anything is possible for this guy. So I'm not going to read all of this because it's essentially quite dull. And it comes from a guy called Joseph Bast, who is one of the key climate change or global warming deniers, if you want to call it that. He's an interesting character, actually. I mean, he's, again, with all these guys, the more you read, the deeper you go, the more interesting it gets. But I just want to pick out this word conundrum. He says, the NIPCC, and he's one of the chief authors of it, reports were conceived and written to offer a new way out of this conundrum. So by using the word conundrum, he immediately puts into play the idea that there's a problem that needs to be resolved. Okay. So up front, and that word kind of, if you read his whole thing, if you read the whole article he writes, you kind of gloss over that word conundrum because it just kind of passes you by. And you kind of want to go back and what conundrum is there? Yeah, and he talks about they are written in a style that laymen without special training can understand, which is fantastic. We probably need more of that. Okay. So there's nothing necessarily wrong in his intent in that sense. I think one of the big problems of the climate change science is how do we communicate it in a way that people can actually understand. I tried, jeepers, like the thousands of articles you have to wade through, and it becomes very, very difficult. Okay, so I'll leave this up. I think we'll distribute these PowerPoints. People can read the full quote later. But the key thing there is this idea of putting into play a particular kind of doubt that's important. Okay. So this is from the NIPCC. So Berman said factual debates often leave people overwhelmed by the science. He's correct about that as well. He might be Dr. Evil, but he's very smart. But if you can get enough people on your side, you get people into a position of paralysis about the issue. When my friends and I play Risk, I don't know if anyone's a big Risk fan here, we talk about analysis paralysis. When you can't make a decision because you're paralyzed by all the options that you have at your disposal. So the idea here really is that if you can plant enough doubt, and doubt is a good thing, because doubt is what makes us inquire and want to read more. But if you can plant enough doubt around something, then the battle's half won. Okay. Then that thing I said earlier about the values of a community they come into play. If enough people share their doubt, it becomes infectious. Okay. I think Johnny would have addressed that with stuff yesterday as well, the idea of communities of doubt. But there are other ways. So this is another way of flipping the debate around. So here's mirroring and what's called culture jamming. So here's an example where Greenpeace started a fake Shell website with exactly the same interface as Shell, and they encouraged people to, they left up a series of images that Shell themselves had put forward for, these were images that Shell used for its own adverts, and they just left the box open, and people could write whatever they wanted, and then they uploaded it. So when you actually search for Shell, you get this site as many times as you get the Shell site. So now the activists can play the game too. So here's a good example. If we monitor our drills like we do our websites, we're going to be fine. And then there was this one as well. Why walk when you can drive? So, and there's lots of these. So this was an example of what they call hacktivism, where activists essentially hack into a pre-existing publicity campaign and they reorientate it towards their own ends. So there is a contest. It's not as if, one shouldn't see this as like a bunch of defenseless sort of peaceniks being sort of pushed to the wall by rapacious corporations. There are ways in which where the fight goes both ways. It is a contest. And what's really interesting is to see how images are redeployed and reused. The idea of culture jamming has been around for a long time. It's often used in corporate environments. I should have worn one of my shirts today, but there's a very famous campaign in South Africa some years ago done by Laugh It Off, where they repurposed corporate slogans. So Standard Bank became Standard Wank. Carling Black Label became Carling Black Labor. What's it? Black Labor, White Guilt. So they repurposed the actual slogans by SAB and then redid them. So the idea of the culture jam or the redeployment of an image is quite a common tactic for activists to sort of oppose what they see as a kind of a sort of corporate, or particularly in this case, a big oil initiative. This is another one that actually was put up as a billboard in the States. You can't run your SUV on Qt, okay? So, and this is public. This isn't just on the internet. This is an example of a public space. People driving into the city are going to see this broad and wide in front of them. Okay, very simply what these things refer to is what's termed the idea of scripto-visual rhetoric, which is a fancy way of just saying how words and image relate to one another. So these were quite interesting. This is what a student of mine was working on last year. She was analyzing the covers of all the IPCC reports going back to the 90s. And she found some quite interesting anomalies. So the one on the right, which is an early one, I might add, when you look at that, you kind of think, what is that image communicating? It looks like a travel brochure. If you look carefully, there's like a guy on a deck chair. It's a lovely desert. He's got a pina colada. Are we supposed to be concerned? Are they trying to say that the world's going to become a series of islands because of, what are they saying? Are they kind of saying global warming is excellent because we can go on holiday more? Are they advertising, like what? What are they doing? And the question there is, whose decision is that? Who in the IPCC says, this is a fantastic image, this will totally represent what we're putting in our report? Because it bears no resemblance at all to what is actually inside that report. I mean, if you read the text and the cover image, you're thinking they're two different things. So the important thing here is that it's possible to get images completely wrong if you're trying to communicate with your audience. Best intentions in the world, but complete failure, okay? The one on the left, slightly different. It's about climate mitigation. There, at least, it's not the most amazing image, but at least they have the idea of the couple riding their bikes. There's a wind generator, wind turbine behind them. So there's a suggestion there, and the way the image structures, which from climate change down, everything kind of works. It's got a proper triangulation. It works a bit better as an image. Okay. So the one on the left is at least, it might be bland, but it's a slightly more successful attempt to communicate what is actually in the document through the image, whereas the one on the right is massively confused. Okay. So this is the last case study I want to quickly look at, the famous, the 97% controversy. This is huge. I've spent weeks looking at this. It's like, it really is rabbit hole stuff. So, and at one point you feel like you have to come up and resume reality. And I'm going to go back, I'm not a scientist, so bear with me. So the context most people have heard about this in before is this phrase. I've used Barack Obama's one, but actually there's numerous people who said the same thing. Obama tweeted, and I think that's quite crucial, tweeted, 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made and dangerous. Oh, huge storm, okay? For example, I found one of the numerous complainers, 97% of climate scientists agree is 100% wrong, Alex Epstein, who also argued that the fact that species are becoming extinct is not really our problem. Like, it's not really most species aren't of benefit to us, so we shouldn't worry about them going extinct. So I kind of take what he says with a pinch of salt. But that was from the Wall Street Journal, I might add. So it wasn't a crackpot website. This was the Wall Street Journal editorial. Op-ed page. So what Cook actually said, the guy who wrote the report, is among abstracts expressing a position on anthropogenic global warming, 97.1% endorsed the consensus position that humans are causing global warming, which doesn't fit in a tweet. Okay, it's more than 140 characters for a start. Okay, and it's boring. Okay, among abstracts expressing a position on, whoa, hang on a second, and this is where this study got into trouble. Okay, and I'm not denying eventually what Cook found, after 12,100 whatever papers that they analyzed, only a certain number of them actually expressed a position, according to him and his authors, on climate change, which was like 79. Okay, and of those 79, like 77 were like totally, it's like human. So then people who wanted to tear the stats apart said, hang on, 79 out of 12,100 people, abstracts that you looked at. So the thing about it is that, and Cook has gone back, and there's been a lot of defenses of Cook as there are attacks. And you can read all of them. I mean, if you've got months in the year, feel free. It's often quite nerve-wracking, you know. So the problem with it is even for someone like myself, who's, you know, I'm educated, I've spent my life at university, I actually really want to know. Jeepers creepers, after like reading 2 reports written by statisticians, my brain just kind of crumpled. I had that Gary Larson thing, my cerebral cortex just kind of fell apart in front of me. It was like all liquid. I had to start over. It's like, oh, come on, can someone just lay this out for me in plain terms? Like, is he wrong or is he right? But of course, it's statistics. So he's both wrong and right. Depending on how you evaluate expressing a position, well, that's a bit of a can of worms. Having value is another one. He talks about the value of the abstract. They only counted abstracts then that were written by people who had published in climate science before. So what constituted climate science specifically was another can of worms. So the thing about stats is that that's how that 97%, which has now become one of the most controversial hot button topics in climate change science, it came from there, okay? So you can see how immediately there's a wide variance at play here. In terms of if anyone here wants to find out what that really means, get ready to read, okay? A lot. And at the end of it, you still won't know, really, whether Cook is right or wrong. Okay, and I'll get to why that may or may not be a thing. So, but consider this question. Should we need 100% certainty? Everyone's fixated on the number. Maybe it was 79%. Someone said 75%, and he inflated it to 79%. Someone said it was 0.3%. Oh. Is the 100% certainty needed to prompt us to action? So if I publish research that argue that in 50% of car accidents, those passengers not wearing seatbelts did not die. As a result, seatbelts should not be optional. Should be optional, not mandatory. And if I added to that, the consumption of alcohol was 3 times as likely to lead to a fatal accident as speeding, you know, we should relax speed limits. As I said, because, you know, wind in my hair. Like, why shouldn't I be able to drive as fast? So I can drive my car. I can do 200 Ks now because I'm an experienced driver. He should be doing 60 Ks now because he can't drive. I can drive. He can't. Okay? Value systems. So the point about it is, at what point do we actually do something? Do we need 100% consensus before we act? If someone said your house is going to burn, 50% chance your house is going to burn down if you don't do this, I'm probably going to do that. 50-50, I don't know. I probably would, you know. So this goes to the notion of risk. We don't need 100% certainty to act. We don't in any other part of our lives, so why this? Okay. So I just quickly gathered together a range of ways in which this has been represented. So the one is the basic idea of the chart or the pie graph, used all the time now. People like to visualize their information. So this is a standard one about what does the 97% actually look like? Well, it looks like that. Okay, that's a very standard graph. This one, more interestingly, looks at research over time. So this kind of says, in 1991, only 65 people were yes and 4 were no. Now it's like 521 are yes and it's only 9 that are no. So this is trying to indicate to us a scale of time, which the pie chart can't really do. Okay, so this is another way of representing that fact or that data. This one is another representation. It kind of gives you a field of people. It's equivalent of like filling a room. Okay, 97 people here and 3 people there. This one, to me, more interestingly, kind of almost represents it like you're amongst them. You're confronted by 100 people, 97 of whom think this and 3 think that. Okay. This is an interesting one. So this is CNBC, an American network channel on climate change, 45-55 split. Here, the other pie chart, 97-3 split. So this is a way, this is done by the Media Matters website. This is a way of trying to shine a light on how news media outlets are reporting in a way that's very, very contrary to the established. And again, that word consensus is another, I didn't tell you that. Consensus, whoa, what does consensus mean? Okay. Then you get obviously the idea of the political cartoon, which is another way of communicating in very direct ways. I'm sure a lot of you have read Zapiro's cartoons. He's a very skilled cartoonist. So often cartoonists are very good at, without words often, with very few words, kind of bringing a whole debate to a point. You know, this is for them the version of the 97.3, you know, is the old. And of course, what cartoons often do is they draw on intertextuality. They draw on other frames that we know about. So the I'm with stupid is an old sort of thing, T-shirt that goes back to the 70s, being redeployed. So this is something that came up from the World Wildlife Fund. So this is a different way of thinking about the 97.3 split. Okay. So again, what this does is it relates to experience. So it's easy if you're looking at a whole field of stats or graphs to get kind of despondent because like, you're overwhelmed by stuff flying over your head. You can't read the stats. It's just numbers. This kind of turns it into a narrative. And this is where the media angle is quite interesting, is how do we, one of the ways in which we communicate about it is by turning the stats, the data, into a narrative. How does this make sense to people every day? So if you say 97 scientists, CO2 emissions is this, is that, it's global warming, solar flares, people think, okay, here's a bridge. If you're going to drive over it, it's going to collapse. What do you think about that? Oh, that makes sense. I totally get it now. Okay, so we can narrativize the data. It makes sense to us. It relates to our lives. It relates to our daily experience. So the idea of daily experience is very, very important in this regard as well. So this is one that's been buzzing around for a while as well. And this is like a film. Plot idea. 97% of the world's scientists contrive an environmental crisis but are exposed by a plucky band of billionaires and oil companies. Okay? So the sarcasm here relates very much to where the money comes from. Because one of the great disputes from the kind of the denialists, put them that for the moment, is that everyone complains about how they have so much money, but all the people doing the research are funded by the UN, for Pete's sake, and by governments. They get tons of money, which is probably true. I think it's a bit of a myth that these kind of scientists are burrowing away thanklessly in some sort of airless garret somewhere trying to pump out research with no money. There's huge amounts of money going into climate science. There's no doubt about it. But it's a completely fair fight. It's not exactly. And of course, one of the big issues recently with climate change is that when people don't disclose where their funding comes from. So the big scandal at the Smithsonian last year, where one of their key writers hadn't revealed that he was getting paid $1.5 million by the Koch brothers to produce a report, which clearly cast doubt on the research that he was producing. So this notion of not revealing your bona fides is very, very important, where the money comes from. Okay, so this cartoon as well. I'm kind of with these guys. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And this goes to the point really about what I said earlier about how we make these opinions. The key thing for me is that I think a lot of us make our opinions because we line up our opinion on this topic along with several others. So if you're wanting to learn about climate change and the people who are writing about it also have an opinion on abortion, on same-sex marriages, on inequality, and you line up with those other kind of more specifically moral issues, it's likely that you're then going to make a decision on this one, of which you don't know anything about the science, based on its affiliation with other things. Very few of us actually know the science, okay? And the tough thing is when you have the one guy who says, but I've got a degree in physics, and you think, oh, okay. Like, does that just disqualify me completely from having a debate? The fact that you have a degree in physics or chemistry or something. So the key thing is for a lot of us, when we're making our opinions, we are lining up our opinion based on its affiliation with other similar opinions. It's a group values thing again. Okay. So most of us, if I gave you all a straw poll and said, give me an opinion right now, yes or no, you'd probably think about it, or you probably will be terrified and say yes. But the thing about it, you'd probably think about it based on like, how do I think about this other thing? What are my political affiliations? How do I stand on like gun violence? How do I stand on all these other things, voter rights and so forth? So all of these things become a set of values, a set of issues that we then have to make an opinion about. And our opinion on climate change, not based on the science, is actually going to be derived from an affiliation with all these other issues. And that's the really key thing. So the final thing I want to get to just quickly is this notion of slow violence. It's the last couple of slides. There's an amazing book by Rob Nixon, who is a South African scholar who's now based between, I think, Princeton and Wisconsin. He's won several international awards for this book. It's called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And what Nixon does, and I'm just going to give you literally right from his introduction, he says, violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. So his point all the way through the book is he looks at the duration of environmental catastrophe, okay? Things that take a long period of time. For example, Chernobyl, or the after effects of war, like spraying Agent Orange in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, okay? So he looks at the long, he says the stories that are forgotten over time. Because after a while, who really cares? Vietnam was whatever, 1975, who cares anymore? It was like 40 years ago. But actually, there are still people who are suffering from the effects of Agent Orange now, okay? So he says violence, when he talks about, he says violence is conceived for most of us as immediate, a spectacle, as explosive, dramatic, newsworthy, and even more so now. If you think about the attacks in Paris, everyone was like up to date. New footage on there's this thing on my iPhone about a guy who was in the concert hall when it happened, and he filmed it as there's this huge clamor to have the more up-to-date, more dramatic, more sensational footage, what he calls erupting into instant sensational visibility. We want that from our violence. Okay, we love that in our violence. We're fascinated by it. Okay, what we're less fascinated by, or we're often quite disgusted by, is the long dyings, staggered and staggering discounted casualties, both human and ecological, that result from wars, toxic aftermaths, or climate change, are underrepresented in strategic planning as well as in human memory. And he looks at the media as being one of the things the book is about, how the media reports on stories. How long does a story take before it falls off our attention? So a key one he mentions, this is one I picked up, was Bhopal. I don't know if you probably remember it. I remember this as a kid. It's the first time. Bhopal was the Union Carbide explosion in 1984 in Delhi, where they pumped thousands of cubic feet of whatever, cyanide into the air. Official death toll was about 5,800. Unofficial death toll at the time, because they were poor Indians living in a slum next to the factory, was 25,000. And all these years later, the case still hasn't come to court. In 2011, they were still trying to file charges against the CEO of Union Carbide. 2011. That is 20-odd years after, 27 years after the event. There have been hundreds of thousands of cases of birth defects and cancers from that same community that are still happening today. So for someone like Nixon, he says that is the actual toll. That story, which died literally in 1985, I remember seeing it on the news as a kid. It died on the news. No one's heard of Bhopal since then, really. I mean, how many of you have heard about Bhopal? Okay, a smattering. There, 15, 20. In the last 5 years?
Yeah, since BP had that.
Since BP, yeah. So that was, but it's not exactly high on anyone's agenda in terms of news. So Bhopal is a classic example of how the slow violence takes place and how it's generally the poor who suffer. The people who aren't represented in those big media stories are the people who suffer these long durations. So for Nixon, the same applies to something like climate change or any long-term effect. Okay, any long-term process, it doesn't have that same immediacy. I've put the link there, by the way, to the story, which is a very interesting BBC story that ran recently. So just some questions here. And how do we represent ecological and social catastrophe is really one way to think about it. How do we talk about it? How do we make it so we don't get overwhelmed by all the worry and the depression? How can we and should we use images? Is there an ethics to images? What are those ethics? Even in this lecture, I think for most of them put up a sort of reference point of where I found the images. We should always be aware of where images come from, who originated them, how they were conceived, what process they went through to reach us. And what is the role of the media in communicating with publics? One of the great myths, I remember being attacked by a lawyer, she physically attacked me, by a lawyer many years ago when I said, well, the media's got no job being impartial. The media's always biased. It has to be. Shock horror. I said, where's this notion of media impartiality come from? It's ludicrous. Media can't be partial, otherwise there wouldn't be any news. So I said, and there's a great documentary filmmaker from the 60s who said, if you don't pick a side, you're not worth it. He says, you're not a documentary filmmaker. So the thing about the media is we have this notion still that the media has this kind of sacrosanct space, the fourth estate we like to know, that's kind of unchallenged in terms of its impartiality. It's not impartial at all. It never has been. And that's a good thing. It needs to be partial in a way. Okay, because even if we take Cook's study of the 97%, how on earth can you be impartial about that? It's impossible. Therefore, if the media was properly impartial, it would be impossible to write anything about Cook's study in the media. Because really, who knows? Okay. Confirmation biases about how we want the stats to say what we hope they're going to say from before we start reading and so forth. So this notion of how the media, the role of the media in communicating with publics with all of these issues we've dealt with this week, whether it's about vaccination or whether it's about cosmological events, whether it's about homo naledi, all of these are key issues where there is actually a debate there, and it's not easy to say that this is a right or a wrong answer. What we need to be aware of is the processes by which we get to the right and the wrong answer are the same. They both involve a whole series of agendas that are personal, that are organizational, and we need to be aware of. We need to look for those when we're reading them. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Slides are going to be on the website.
Yeah, I need to upload. Is that where they're going to be? If I give them to you? Where to? Yeah.
The lectures are recorded. If you want the slides, maybe you can email me. My email address has been up. I'll write it down here.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides if people want.
Where are the lecture recordings going to be?
It's supposed to be on the Summer School website.
On the Summer School website, and there will also be a link on the UCT website. But I think the best place to try is first the Summer School website.
Any questions? Sorry, I didn't give anyone a chance to speak there. Yes.
As you get older, you tend to forget where you learned what a word means.
Yeah.
And I've got a simple little disk on my computer, it came with the paper dictionary, which gives sort of three-line definitions. And if you look up a word like science, you suddenly realize you've been thinking a little bit differently to what is the accepted definition. And sometimes I think we tend to accept a word without saying, what does it mean?
But we also, here's a good example I gave my media students some years ago. Oh, sorry. Oh, the question was about words and how they mean. It was a comment about how we use words unthinkingly because we assume that they have a certain meaning, and what if they don't? So some years ago, Robert Mugabe was speaking at maybe in the COP conference. It was in Durban. And Tony Blair was there as well, so that was kind of fun. And I have to be honest, Robert Mugabe completely schooled Tony Blair. He did him inside out. It was quite fascinating to watch. I'm sort of disclosure, I hate Tony Blair. And I took this news report that was about one of Mugabe's comments, and I gave it to my media students the next day. And one of Mugabe's comments was quite flagrantly propagandistic. He said, some whites in Zimbabwe own up to 100 farms. And it was like, no one owns 100 farms, maybe 2 or 3. No one owns 100 farms. It's a ridiculous statement, blah, blah, typical of Mugabe, power, etc., etc. So then I said to my media students, okay, define a farm. What's a farm? And they said, it's like a place where they grow stuff. And I said, okay, they grow stuff on farms. How big is a farm? And of course, if you drive through the Karoo, a farm is like 30 k's by 30 k's long if you're driving through Liuchamka and that kind of part of the world. Or if you go to Australia, you go to those cattle stations that are hundreds of thousands of hectares. Or if you go to the wheat farms in the Free State, or even bigger ones in the Midwest and the States. A farm is freaking enormous. One farm is like 100,000 hectares. If you go to community lands in the eastern part of Zimbabwe, farms are maybe, one farmer probably has an acre or 2 acres. Ergo, and I'm not defending Mugabe here because he completely said it for the wrong reasons, but he's not wrong. If one just is loose with the definition of what a farm is, but we all have our own preconceived notion of what a farm means. Everyone knows what a farm is. It's in the dictionary. It doesn't say in the dictionary how big it has to be. It's just a farm. It's a place where we grow stuff. Okay, so right there, there's immediately there's a contested idea. We've got this accepted idea, and our own values, our community values, which guides our individual understanding, tells us what a farm is. And when we meet someone who says, "But a farm is something else," we think, well, maybe it isn't. Question, yeah.
And no, in the United States, I don't even think of a farm as something where you grow things. I think of a farm as where they raise cattle and they raise animals.
Yeah.
Because I'm from an agricultural part of California, and I mean, there are big farms, but when you say, like, people always ask me, did you grow up on a farm? And I didn't, but my friends did, and a farm is just a little small
Yeah.
area where you have like one cow. And
We have things like small holdings, like one of those words we have, you know. Yes.
And my comment's somewhat tangential to your presentation, but the Bhopal incident there is very interesting when you come into the area of crisis management, because it was one of the first crises that evolved out of, let's say, the chemical industry, for the context. And for example, industry has, I think, used that as a starting point for how to handle crisis work. The Taliban after took place in the USA handled that absolutely magnificently. And you probably learned from how that Anderson was the CEO.
Yeah. Anderson's the guy who doesn't, yeah.
Directly to Bhopal and was jailed for 24 hours, which was a magnificent gesture by him. Of course, it hasn't solved the problem, I understand that. But I just wanted to make that comment that Bhopal is still alive, so to speak, in certain, let's say, theatres of thinking.
It is, and I think what's interesting about it is that when the Deep Horizon spill happened, there was also, I mean, I remember even when Exxon Valdez happened, which was in the early 90s, Bhopal was still there as a presence. I think what's changed nowadays is that obviously the access to the internet and the quick dissemination of information makes it much. So, for example, Deep Horizon, a lot of heads rolled on that because they failed to act. But because they failed to act because it was so quick. Even in 1984 when Bhopal happened, it took days for people to find out about it. So there was enough time to think, to strategize. Now so I think now, in a way, one of the benefits of the wide dissemination of information on the internet is that people can act quickly. People can literally text while things are happening. Think about what's happening with the Black Lives Matter campaign in the States. The people who've been shot by police, who've been killed by police, when it's actually happened live and it's immediately been put on the internet, cops don't have time to produce a contesting narrative. And that's been one of the reasons why it's had so much potency, is because it's instant. They're doing it in front of people with phones. It's ridiculous. You kind of think, don't do anything in front of someone with a phone. Which is this kind of, so it's interesting about how that works as well. Yes?
What do you do about the problem of the Goebbels statement, the lie oft repeated becomes the truth? In a particular case, you cited the case. It's quite clear that the 97% of John Cook is actually a lie. The statistics are quite clearly against it. Yet it's a meme that is spread around the world.
I think, I mean, again, I'm not a scientist. Neither am I a statistician. So, a good example of how of that is I read a column by a local writer, Ivo Vechter, he's sort of rather Epstein. He's quite an ardent libertarian, and he wrote a piece that trashed one of the COP climate talks. And I decided to do a little bit of research, so I found one of the references that he used. Okay, so I thought, let me do the thing and go through this very respectable sounding journal, and that was an article that actually contested the 97%. So this was an anti the 97% thing. So I read the article. It sounded relatively reasonable, but I could already see that they deliberately misquoted some of Cook's statistics. When I actually read Cook, they just misquoted him. And then I looked at the authors. I thought, okay, let me do. So I Googled the authors. It takes hours. So I Googled. The one author was an intelligence design proponent from a small university in the UK. The second guy had no affiliation with any university at all. He was an online stats guru. And the third guy was Lord Monckton. Now, Lord Monckton was considered too right-wing for UKIP. They kicked him out because his policies were too right of what UKIP was thinking about environment. Okay, those were the three authors of the paper. So now I'm thinking, okay, so that's a crap paper. It may have been published in a vaguely reputable-looking journal, but then when I check the journal against the Thomson ISI ratings, it has no rating at all. In order for me to do that, I had to have access through the university to the kinds of stats that people don't have in the public space. I was able to download the journal article for free because it wasn't embargoed. I was able to access Thomson ISI Science and look at the ratings. Who has the time for that? But that was just one article that Vechter cited in his entire thing. So I thought, well, that's a terrible example that you're using, and based on that, I'm probably going to disagree with everything else he says. So when I've read stuff on the Cook, I look at Cook's stats, and the problem for me as a humanities person is that stats are terrible. Like, what are you trying to prove? And it's not that I'm anti-Cook. I think Cook's study, when you actually look at his reasoning, his stats, he's not lying, but because he can't be telling the truth, because there's no truth in what he's proposing. He's proposing an idea. He's saying that in the study that I did, and his answer to a lot of people's quote, at one point Cook got onto a message board, he said, if you want to disprove me, go and do your own damn study. Go and you read the same 12, and there were errors. I mean, all these stats things are these what they call variations. So yeah, one of the couple of the studies were incorrectly, and of course the problem was he had a rating system of 1 to 7 based on how the readers of all, because he couldn't read all 12,000 articles himself. So all his readers had to tick off a box on a 1 to 7 about what the value of the paper was in terms of the study. Hang on, values again. Whoa, that's bad. So the thing about it is at some point, he kind of said, this is what I think. And he clearly was trying to prove a point that was predetermined. So it's possible to take exactly the same papers that Cook took and come to a different conclusion. And I would look at those two sets of stats and say, pick the stats you like. I don't think either one of them is wrong. I really don't. I think Epstein is wrong when he says that the entire study is wrong, because his own argument was completely flawed. I mean, to the point where Epstein literally quotes things that aren't in Cook's article. But then again, if you read Epstein on the Wall Street Journal, are you really going to take the time to download Cook and do a Google search to make sure that the quote that is quoting Cook is actually is correct? No. But Epstein just lied. He just misquoted him because no one's going to bother to do the follow-up. So the thing about it is that and that's the rabbit hole. You know, how long do you spend down there before you kind of want to go back and have a hamburger or something? You know? So, yeah.
You keep describing yourself as not being a scientist, but you're a very healthy skeptic. And so surely is the hallmark of a scientist.
If you knew my father, he'd be spinning around there and he'd say, no, science is pure and unfair. All you social science people are just muddying the water. Which is partly true. I mean, that's one of the issues around in our environmental humanities collective is exactly one of the doubts we have is against empirical evidence. What does empirical evidence actually give us? How do we... I am. I mean, in that broad sense, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm a skeptic.
Thank you.
But if you say skeptic, you can also be like, I'm a skeptic about, for example, if you say you're a skeptic about UFOs, it means a totally different thing to saying I'm a skeptic about climate change. If you say I'm a climate change skeptic, that might mean I'm a climate change denier, or it might mean that I'm, so skeptic is shaky. Yeah. All these words.
The discussion here for now.